In this video, we're covering Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. The Xbox Series X and S make a great Game Boy emulation platform because of its use of shaders, integrated controllers, and the fact that it can support link cable play. And best of all, it doesn't take much to get it set up. All you need are some Game Boy games and you're pretty much off to the races. Now, there are a number of Game Boy and Game Boy Color cores available on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch, so the two you're really going to want to focus on are Sameboy and Gambatte. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, as we get started, this guide is a continuation of my Retroarch and Dev Mode install guide, so if you don't have your Xbox Series X and S put into Dev Mode, this is the guide for you, as well as how to get Retroarch installed and set up for initial purposes. So follow along with this video, get everything going. Make sure that you have a properly formatted USB drive as shown in the video or in these two separate videos if you already have it installed but don't have a USB drive set up, and then continue along with this guide. So to get Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation up and running on our Xbox Series X and S, we just need to source some Game Boy games. If you have a large physical collection of Game Boy games, I can't recommend the Retro Blaster programmer enough for dumping your cartridges as well as the intact save files for any games that may still have one. Another great option is the GB operator. I don't have any videos on that one just yet, but I'm hoping to cover it in the future. Or, you could always resort to the Googles and do things that way. I really don't care which way you go about doing it, but remember, piracy is not condoned on this channel, so don't ask me for illegal download links as they will not be provided. But once you have your Game Boy games sourced, Game Boy games usually will have the .gb extension. They could also be zipped up, and Game Boy Color games will have the .gbc extension. And again, they could also be zipped up. But once you have your game sourced, go ahead and plug your USB drive that you use for your Xbox emulation projects into your PC and get it opened up. Once open, just go ahead and add your Game Boy games to your games folder. So if you use the formatting program, you'll have a Game Boy folder that you can put things in, but I don't use my folders in that format, so I'm just going to add these to my games folder just like this. And there we go. They are now ready. So we can just go ahead and get this all closed up, move the USB drive over to the Xbox, and get booted into Retroarch. Once inside Retroarch, we can begin loading up our Game Boy content. So one method of doing so is to go to Load Content, navigate down to the E drive, find your games folder, go to your Game Boy games folder, select a game, and then you can choose one of the very, very many GB cores to play it and run it. So again, for today's video, we are going to be focusing on Sameboy and Gambatte. But that method is pretty long-winded, so I'm not a big fan of it. So instead, what I like to do is create a games playlist. So to do this, go down to Import Content, and you could do a scan directory for your Game Boy games. So just head to your games folder, find your Game Boy games folder, and tell it to scan this directory. And once finished, you should see a Game Boy playlist entry here on the left. Now just do the same thing for your Game Boy Color games. And now you should have a playlist here on the left for Game Boy Color as well. Now, there are a couple of Game Boy Color games I have in here that the scan wasn't able to find, such as the limited run games re-release of Shantae and a homebrew game from Mr. E. So if you have games that don't show up, go back into Import Content, and this time go down to Manual Scan. Choose your game directory. So for me, I'm going to go back to my Game Boy Color games, because that's the one where it couldn't find some of them. Tell it to scan this directory, system name. Go down to Nintendo, and select the appropriate Game Boy system. You can choose a default core if you want. I'm going to leave it as unspecified for this version. Make sure Scan Recursively is on in case you have games separated into subdirectories. And then if your games are zipped, make sure Scan Inside Archives is on. And then just tell it to start the scan. And now, there we go. There's Shantae and Sapphire Hotel, the two that were missing from my initial scan directory. But to play a game from a playlist, all you need to do is select it, tell it to run, and then select a core to run it with. So we're going to start with Sameboy. And there we go. Game Boy games up and running on our Xbox Series X and S through the Sameboy core. So Sameboy is a very accurate Game Boy core, and again has the link cable functionality built into it, which is just fantastic. But let's go ahead and cover some of the advanced options available to us within Sameboy. So inside our Retroarch quick menu, scroll down to Core Options, and our first set of options are System Options. And the first option in this menu is Emulated Game Boy Model, and this does require a content restart if it is changed. So it's set to auto-detect for an original Game Boy or a Game Boy Color. If desired, you can manually select other types of systems for it to be using. So for example, on Shantae, this actually has Game Boy Advance compatibility and enhancements. So I could tell it to run as a Game Boy Advance to get those extra features out of Shantae. Next, auto-detect Super Game Boy models. So this also requires a content restart if you change any of the options, but it's set to Super Game Boy for NTSC regions by default. You can change this over to a Super Game Boy for PAL or the Super Game Boy 2. And our last option within this menu is Real-Time Clock Emulation. It will automatically sync up to your console's time. You can select accurate if you want, but there's really no reason to. Alright, backing out, Video tab. Game Boy Mono Palette. So this one does require you to be using just the original Game Boy as a system override instead of like the Game Boy Color or the Game Boy Advance. But the Game Boy Mono Palette, this is set to grayscale by default. You can change this over to Lime to more accurately mimic the original Game Boy screen. Give it more of an olive look to be more like the Game Boy Pocket, or give it a teal look to match the Game Boy Light. Or if you just prefer the black and white, hey, that's available. Our next option is for Game Boy Color color correction. So this applies a different type of color correction profile to your Game Boy Color emulation. So it's set to Modern Balanced by default, which looks something like this. You can change it to Modern Accurate, Modern Boost Contrast, Reduce Contrast, Correct Color Curves, Harsh Reality, yep, or you can turn it off entirely to just get a standard emulator output. Personal preference on which one you might want to use, but do note if you're using shaders, the off option will probably be the best. Next up, Ambient Light Temperature. This is another Game Boy Color specific option here, but you can choose the color temperature that your games are going to be running in, so it really can affect the output image. So if you want everything to have a more blue feel to it, or super red. But the 6500K is your standard option and one you'll probably want to leave it on. Next up, Display Borders. So this is set to only for Super Game Boy games, but you can turn it always on, or you can turn it off. So many games had Super Game Boy border data attached to them, so you can get a wonderful look like that if you want to have that border. Personal preference, but I typically only use it when I'm trying to do Super Game Boy stuff. Alright, backing out of the Video tab, Audio. Our first option in here is to do a high pass filter for our Game Boy audio output. So this is set to accurate by default to give it the most accurate representation of the Game Boy audio output. We also have Preserve Waveform as another selectable option, personal preference on which one you will like to use. Our next option is Interference Volume. So because the Game Boy and the speaker would interfere with each other, it would cause a buzzing or a different type of sound. So you can emulate that effect with this slider. Personal preference, I like clean audio output, so I leave it on 0. Next up, Input. Rumble Mode. So there are a couple of Game Boy Color games that had rumble features. It is set to only for rumble enabled games by default, but you could also tell it to always apply to see if the emulator has some rumble effects for other games. There also might be rumble patches for some games, I can't remember off the top of my head. But if you don't even want to emulate rumble, you could just set it to never. And with that, we've covered all of the core options within Sameboy. So if there are options you want to have set for some games but not others, so for example, your system hardware for Shantae in my example, you can head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file so that way those options apply for that specific game and not others. Alright, now let's do a quick demo on how to get Super Game Boy emulation up and running within the Sameboy core. So, if you go into your quick menu, head into the core options, go to the System tab, and change the emulated model over to one of the Super Game Boy options. So I'm just going to choose the original Super Game Boy here for myself, and then I'm just going to save this as a game options file for Pokemon Blue. And this does require a content restart, so I'm just going to close out of it. And then rerun it, and now we are playing it in Super Game Boy form, so we will have full color emulation and our Super Game Boy border. So there we are, Super Game Boy emulation up and running within Sameboy. Now let's go ahead and cover link cable emulation. A good number of Game Boy games offered link cable support and not just Pokemon. But anyway, to get these up and running, we just need to head over to the main menu on Retroarch, go to Load Core, scroll down to Nintendo and find the Sameboy core. Once the core is loaded, you'll see a new Subsystems tab here, so press A on this. And it is to load up a 2-player Game Boy link. So current content Game Boy number 1 is our first option. So this is where we're going to choose our first Game Boy ROM. So just navigate to your games folder. And I'm going to choose Pokemon Red for my first one. Now go back into Subsystems and select a game for Game Boy number 2. And for this one, I'm going to choose Pokemon Yellow. Now go back into Subsystems again and start the 2-player Game Boy Link option. And you will now see that there are 2 Game Boy screens running at once. So you will need a second controller hooked up to your Xbox to take full advantage of this feature. But now just a quick demo of it in action. So we have Pokemon Yellow on the bottom, Pokemon Red on top, both using my completed save files. And here we go, loaded up into a trade here. And I'm actually using the same team on both, which is pretty funny. But anyway, let's go ahead and trade Blastoise for Blastoise, because it really doesn't matter. And there we go, a successful trade with link cable emulation on the Xbox Series X and S. Now, it is optimal to use 2 different ROM files for your link cable emulation, but if you want to use the same ROM file, it's going to make a second save file for that game specifically for Player 2. Player 1 will get the default save, Player 2 will get their own save. Whereas if you use 2 individual games, they will each have their own save. And you, of course, can use this for more than just link cable emulation. Say you want to play 2 Game Boy games at the same time with someone else in the household. You can do that. It's perfectly doable. But with link cable emulation enabled, we do get more core options to mess with within Sameboy. The first one being link cable emulation, so you can turn this on or off. Next, you can adjust the screen positions to left-right instead of top-bottom, so it gives you bigger screens to work with on a 16:9 monitor. Next, you can set the audio output for which emulated Game Boy is getting audio, so between Game Boy 1 and Game Boy 2. And then we have all of the same options we've covered previously for Game Boy models between Game Boy 1 and 2, as well as the Game Boy palettes and color corrections and light temperatures for Game Boys 1 and 2. And then audio options for Game Boys 1 and 2, and input options for Game Boy 1 and 2. But that pretty much covers it as far as Sameboy is concerned, so let's go ahead and move over to Gambatte. So let's go ahead and run Metal Gear Solid, and this time we're going to choose the Gambatte core and tell it to run. Alright, so here we are, Metal Gear Solid up and running within Gambatte. And quite an impressive game if you've never actually given it a shot. Very reminiscent of the MSX versions of the game, but just way more intense. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about some of the core options available to us within Gambatte. So, quick menu, core options. So our first option is Game Boy colorization. This is set to off by default, which just gives you your typical black and white and gray Game Boy emulation. But you can change it over to auto, Game Boy Color, Super Game Boy, internal, and custom. So with the option set to internal, that lets us use our next option, which is the internal palette. So from this, you're able to select a number of different Game Boy color palettes. So DMG is the original Game Boy. You can also select a pocket, light, or any other number of different color schemes to choose from. And our last three options here give us even more options to choose from. So there's the TWB64 Pack 1 and 2 and Pixel Shift Pack 1. So you can select what those look like within these different menus. So here we go. We'll select the Bandai Namco version for Pack 1, and that's what it looks like. You can also change it over to pink. If we select Pack 2, we can change this one over to T. There we go. And then, of course, selecting the Pixel Shift Pack lets us select it from this one right here. So there we go. Our next option is for color correction, and this is applied to Game Boy Color games only. If you want to apply it to Game Boy and Super Game Boy emulation, you could do so as well, but the results aren't as great. So leave this one set to Game Boy Color only unless you're curious. Color correction mode, so this is set to accurate by default, and you can leave it here, or you can choose fast. Next up, color correction. This is going to adjust the position of your lighting. So there is central, which will put it around the middle of the screen. You can also do above, so it's a bit more washed out, or below, which has a bit more contrast. And again, center. I'm personally a fan of below the screen on this one for Gambatte. Next up, dark filter percent. So this will darken the image to make it so that images aren't too bright and reduces eye strain. So you can use this if you want, but again, it just darkens the image. Next up, interframe blending. So this will mimic LCD ghosting for Game Boy models. So there's a simple ghosting effect. Then there's the accurate ghosting effect. And then a faster version of the accurate effect. So on Xbox, if you want to use accurate, go for it. It is great. But do be aware if you're using some Game Boy shaders, it will give you a double ghosting effect, which can mess things up. So do be aware if you're using shaders to go ahead and leave this off. Next up, audio resampler. It's set to sync by default. You can change it over to cosine. Personal preference, which one you think sounds better, I guess. Next up, emulated hardware, set to auto by default, but you can change it between Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Again, if you're playing games like Shantae that have Game Boy Advance enhancements, this is the option to set here. Auto should work, but in case it doesn't, you can automatically set it. Next up, use official bootloaders. This only works if you have Game Boy and Game Boy Color BIOS files within your Retroarch system folder. Acquiring Game Boy BIOS files is very, very difficult, and high-level implementations have been around forever, so there's really no reason to try to get them unless you really want the most authentic experience. But this option is set to on, so if it finds those bootloaders, it will play them for you. Next, allow opposing directions. This isn't going to be useful for most users. Turbo button period, so you can change the speed of turbo functionality. Next, controller rumble strength. This allows you to change the rumble strength for rumble-enabled games. And finally, there is a game link option within Gambatte, which lets you play link cable games over a network. So our first option here is link mode, and this is where you set if you are the network server or the client. So the network server is the IP address that you're going to type in on the client side to get connected over a network. So network server equals player 1, network client equals player 2. So if you are a network client, you're going to type in the IP address of the host that is serving you. So the easiest way to find your IP address on dev mode, you can just go back to your dev mode home screen, and hey, there you go. There is an IP address right here under remote access. So on a network client, you would just type in the IP address of the server's host IP. And with that, we've covered all the core options within Gambatte. So as always, if there's settings you want to have saved for some games but not others, you can head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file, so that way they only apply to that single game and not the core as a whole. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the use of shaders. So Retroarch has extensive shader libraries. That gives you a lot of cool effects. So heading into the shaders tab, make sure that they are enabled, and then you've downloaded them from the online updater. But you can head into load and begin loading them up. So there is a handheld folder here, console borders, and we could choose different console shaders, such as a Game Boy Color shader like this, to give us an accurate representation of Game Boy Color emulation. Unfortunately, it looks like they got rid of the scaled versions of them, But that's okay, because we could just go in here and get different things that we'd rather have instead, such as a Game Boy Color LCD grid shader. So this way, it's nice and large, gives us motion blur and color correction to mimic a Game Boy LCD screen. So as always, shaders are a personal preference thing, so just go ahead and choose a shader you think looks nice for your use case, and run with it. And once you have it set, just head back into the shader tab, click on save, and inside you can save it as a core preset or a game preset, depending on if you want to have every Game Boy game use that shader or just specific ones. And there we have it, Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation within the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. Both the Sameboy and Gambatte cores are great options for emulating Game Boy games, and both offer link cable support, though Sameboy is a bit easier if you're just wanting to play things on the same system and not worry about network configuration. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video helps you get your Game Boy emulation projects up and running to your desires. But here at the end, I do have a couple of huge favors to ask. As always, if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that thumbs up, thumbs down button, depending on how much you like today's video, as well as that sub button and notification bell so you can see when new content comes onto the channel. Loads always coming your way, and I appreciate having each and every one of you along for the ride. For anyone interested in further helping support the channel and keep it going, do be sure to check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link that will appear in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little goes a long way to keeping this place up and running and bringing all of this content to you. Big shout out to all of our current champions. Again, thank you so much for everything you do and believing in us. You are just amazing. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we'll see you back next video.